Good evening. Thank you very much, first, for the warm welcome to Vanderbilt and to the Carpenter Program. I'm delighted to be here. This is my first visit to Vanderbilt. I've been around theological education for a long time, and I have never been to Vanderbilt in my whole life. And so this is my maiden voyage, and I like it very much. It's really terrific. And I remember all my friends saying, oh, we were at Vandy, and I didn't know what Vandy was for the longest time. In Cambridge, we didn't know where Vandy was, but we learned. You know, took us some time. And thank you, Ken, for the lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be part of what I think of as queer theological summer camp, with you, Ken, and Rebecca Alpert as the head counselors. I think the idea of this is genius, just what we need to develop the scholar activists of our movements for the future. How wonderful to have the funding. Ann B. Day is a pioneer in this work and a generous funder and knows what she's doing. How wonderful to have the funding to make a real difference in the field as our emerging colleagues get this powerful jumpstart for your important work. I want to thank Sharon Groves and her HRC colleagues for very effective planning and getting this week organized. I only wish I were going to be here for the whole time to learn and to share with the amazing colleagues who are lined up to participate, and as I have learned already today, the amazing students who really make this thing happen. So thank you for welcoming me and for our good conversation this afternoon. Some of us had a preliminary conversation in the 3 o'clock hour, and it was really very helpful for me to get a feel for you and to deepen in my respect for the work that you're doing. I want to applaud the students who I think have been smart enough to take advantage, including where's our Belgian colleague, our international colleagues, who have been really smart enough to take advantage of this marvelous opportunity for networking and professional development. I want to add a special word of welcome tonight to the folks who've joined us just for the evening. Those of you who have come from HRC and other related groups here in the area. You're in my cabin this summer. Just here for part of the fun, but interested in and excited about the whole venture. So I look forward to talking with some of you over the wine and cheese that we'll share after this is over. My topic tonight is quite simple: what it means to be a responsible academic and how we who are scholars can be useful activists. That's really what I'm going to be hammering away at: responsible academics who are useful activists. I'll explore what I mean by both of these terms, responsible academic and useful activist. And I'll conclude with what I think blocks and conversely what I think facilitates our being both. Today's USA Today, if you see that little McNews sheet, reports that crimes against LGBT people are on the rise. That was the headline. The argument was that visibility can increase our being targets. And of course, there's backlash against all of our moves in the right direction. So I think today our work takes on new urgency, as crimes against us are on the rise. I think the combination responsible academic and useful activist becomes us as queer scholars. I seek to encourage, albeit realistically given the job market and other practicalities, our development in this direction. And I want to assure you from my perspective how much fun it can be. Now, just to tip my hand, I spent 5 summers as a counselor at a Catholic girls' summer camp in the Adirondacks named for Joan of Arc. Camp Jeanne d'Arc, as it's known. Founded in 1923, still going strong. Well, I've long held that my professional life had to be at least as much fun as Camp Jeanne d'Arc, and I can report that up until now it has been. I have no immediate plans to change that. So I stand before you as proof positive that one can be a responsible academic and a useful activist, that it can be fun, and yes, even some of us can make a living at it. That's what I'm trying to be tonight. My remarks will be relatively brief so we can have time for substantive discussion. Then over wine and cheese, we can continue the conversation as we figure out together how we can encourage this approach among ourselves and create the institutions that will make it possible. I sent a number of examples of my own writing that are in your packet. I urge you to consult those for a sense of how I try to do just what I'm discussing tonight. Whether editing anthologies, writing short pieces for religiondispatches.org, or crafting a book review, whether penning a book chapter, occasional pieces for the American Academy of Religion newsletter, or even movie reviews, I try to be a responsible scholar and a useful activist. I brought some copies of an unpublished piece, which I hope you've passed around, on how to blog, which maybe, did you pass those around, how to, like falling off a blog? It might be of interest. Grab the green one, the green sheet if you didn't get them. Blogs are where it's at today in terms of what people actually read. People will read your blog more than they'll read your dissertation. So think about it. Let me start with how to be a responsible academic. I think it's a moral no-brainer to be a responsible academic. I take that to be axiomatic for all graduate students in queer studies, though I may be presuming too much. I applaud those programs that include some form of ethical reflection in their training, although I would observe they remain few and far between. Those of us who do queer studies are often so marginalized or pigeonholed that we mistakenly assume that we're being responsible just because of the content of our work. With all due respect, I have come to the conclusion that there is nothing automatic about the content of our work that means de facto we are engaged in responsible scholarship. We have to be just as vigilant as nuclear physicists or geneticists about keeping our work moral. This pertains to the topics we pursue, the sources we take seriously as admissible data, as well as the ways in which we apply the scholarship we create. There are no guarantees that just because our topic is queer, that our work is responsible. Let me offer a shocking example, perhaps a cautionary tale. I was stunned recently to hear from a professor who works on LGBTIQ issues in religion about a deal he made with a local religious authority. He agreed to write the institutional church's case against us to be published in the local religious newspaper under the byline of the highest authority, if the denomination, which I will not mention, would allow his institution to have a long-planned conference on queer issues. That way, the local leader could demonstrate his anti-queer bona fides for his higher-ups, and the scholar's institution could go ahead with its planned conference. I suppose I shouldn't have been shocked, since there's so much horse trading in academia. But I can say I was dissatisfied, unable to fathom why any scholar working on queer issues would put his or her skills to use in ways that would be detrimental to us, even for the lofty short-term goals of an important conference. In discussion, this colleague had a rather convoluted theological rationale for his actions. Something about how we could possibly be wrong in what we're doing. I didn't get it. It didn't make sense to me. It sounded theoretically based, for better, or in this instance, for worse. Now, this is the limit case for sure. Nonetheless, responsible academics develop our work in concert with the needs of communities of accountability. Otherwise, if we're not developing our work in concert with the needs of communities of accountability, we risk pursuing topics that may hold personal interest, but be of little use in the wider world. I don't mean to suggest that esoteric topics are irresponsible. Imagine if John Boswell had been told that when he was working on his landmark Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality in the 1970s. To the contrary, cutting-edge scholarly work is essential to our movements. But it's in the context of those movements that such work is rooted and accountable. If you don't know tonight who forms your community of accountability, I respectfully suggest it would be a useful exercise to think about it this week. Who is my community of accountability? That will help you to focus your work and hopefully develop it in a moral way. From a feminist liberation theological starting point, my academic work is informed by an explicit commitment to the common good through critical analysis of interlocking structures that oppress some and privilege others, starting with race, sex, gender and gender identity, including colonialism, ageism, and the like. My community of accountability is those feminists who seek to overcome these curiarchal structures, that wonderful word from Elisabeth, Shue, Sofia, Renzo, the curiarchal, that is the interlocking structures of lordship. It's those who seek to overcome these curiarchal structures and replace them with structures that foster justice. That forms my community of accountability. What I do, how I shape my work, the issues that I take on are shaped in that context. Far from compromising some mythic academic objectivity, this starting point allows me to be clear about my commitments and to collaborate with others who are equally explicit about theirs. As my friends of the Grail movement say, together, we're a genius. Together, we're a genius. In this sense, I have come to understand religious studies to be more a team sport than an individual activity, despite how many of you are being male-formed in graduate school. You may find it useful to unlearn some of what you've been taught once you finish your degrees. I'll return to this theme when I look at what blocks our efforts. In recent conversation with a great leader in feminist theology, I was surprised to hear her reflections on her work. She said she was rereading a current academic article, and she found it, and I quote her, boring. Since she writes so well and makes such a positive impact on the field, I have a hard time thinking that a word she might have written might be boring. But it's boring to her. Now, with retirement looming, she prefers to do more accessible writing, geared to an educated lay audience rather than the academic journal crowd. I repeat, she's as good as it gets in the academic study of religion, and she's bored by her own work. Happily, she's beginning to do more of the kind she enjoys. Some people reject such writing with disdain, calling it popular, what could be worse, unscholarly, advocacy-focused, and therefore not the real McCoy academically. I take issue with that analysis. Writers who do not need translation from academic ease to ordinary informed discourse bring the same rigorous academic preparation to their subject. They bring the same authoritative voice that they have earned through graduate preparation, and the same insights that they would apply to a formal scholarly text. In fact, popular writing is another refinement of that process, requiring of the writer an even deeper synthesis and some more skills. Try it sometime and you'll find at least three things. First, it's harder to write less than more. 5,000 words can be easier than just the right 500 words to convey an idea. I'm not talking about tweeting here, but I think that's sort of the extreme case, and it can be challenging. I don't poo-poo it. Secondly, it's harder to say simply in plain English than to rely on our in-house jargon without losing nuance. Kuriarchy, or kuriarchal, is the brilliant, insightful work of Elisabeth Sofia Renzo, which means structures of lordship with all the Greek accoutrements that go with it. But to ordinary people, it means how you're oppressed complexly and a lot as a woman who is black and a lesbian. We need both, the insight into what it is and the way to communicate it so people can take that idea and use it for their own strategies. And third, it's not only harder to write less than more and harder to say things simply than with jargon, it's also harder to get a foot into popular media than it is to get published in certain academic journals. Try getting on TV. Try having your blog read by a lot of people. Try doing a radio show in Spanish. It can be much easier to get published in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. Another equally successful academic said recently to me that she thinks we all need to be bilingual, learning the language of the academy as well as the language of feminist, or in our case, queer studies. It means doing double work to be bilingual, which is not entirely fair, but I think it's a fast route to becoming a responsible academic. I notice how some of us are even more prepared than most people in our fields. Let's recall that Mary Daly had 3 doctorates, 2 of which she earned mostly in Latin. And yet we struggle to get a job, get promoted, or tenured because we're, in fact, doing most of it in high heels and backwards, as they say. Let me describe my own approach, acknowledging that it's not the norm, as an example of how to construct a reasonable and responsible scholarly agenda. As was mentioned by Ken in his kind introduction, I work at a small nonprofit organization called Water, like what you drink, our company product. The Women's Alliance for, it's never far from me, the Women's Alliance for Theology, Ethics, and Ritual inside the Beltway in Silver Spring, Maryland. I divide my work between scholarship and activism, not always equally. I lecture widely and teach most summers at a theological school to keep academic connections. This summer I was at PSR. was it last summer? I was at Lancaster, a couple summers ago at ILIF. I teach at various places. I've served on the editorial board of several journals and websites. Last year, I co-edited an anthology called New Feminist Christianity, Many Voices, Many Views, and published several scholarly articles for encyclopedias and collections both here and in Brazil. I set up a new series of monthly teleconferences with writers from the anthology, and now a broader group of stars in the field, Patrick Chang Tekabao, Sean Copeland, Kwok Puilan, Rosemary Ruther, Virginia Raby Mollenkott, Tracy West, among others, are now part of our teleconferences, which you can get on our website. We're trying to socialize our work, so every month we have an hour-long conversation. Anybody can dial in, and then it's up on the website along with notes from the speaker, so that everybody has access to the kind of theological education you're getting this week. I repeat, I'm trying to socialize our work, making it accessible to a wider public. Oh, now I'm beginning to sound like an activist, but that will come. I also coordinate Water's internship program. This summer we had 3, one woman from Austin Seminary, one woman in a PhD program at Howard, and one woman heading off to the Faith Trust Institute to work with Marie Fortune in the fall. So this internship program includes an educational component. You may drool at this, but we had private Skype sessions with Elisabeth, Shue, Sofia, Renzo, and Judith Plaskow, just us, and a teleconference with Carol Adams, who does the great work on feminism and animal rights. Talk about guest lecturers in my class. So you can see I teach a great deal, although not usually in the classroom. Admittedly, mine is privileged work and possible only because we have crafted a modest but effective infrastructure called Water in which to do it. More about that shortly when I turn to how to facilitate that approach. But first, let's look at useful activists. If I've described responsible scholars, let's look at useful activists. The reality is that our movement for justice needs us as scholars to be fully engaged in struggles for social change. Think about marriage equality and how some people in religion, including scholars, have been useful in bringing that about. There's a value to being in the background, creating the theoretical work that a few people will read, since movements need theory. But I believe that more of us need to be at the table, whether at HRC or NGLTF, on denominational queer advocacy boards, in local groups that are working on referenda. We need to be at the table. We need to bring what Marquette University moral theologian Dan McGuire calls, and I quote, the renewable moral energy of religion to the, unquote, to the work of social change. Dan McGuire, moral ethicist, moral theologian from Marquette, talks about the renewable moral energy of religion. I love the phrase. It's so happy. I wish I had thought of it myself. Kind of an ecological understanding of how the moral energy of our various religious traditions can, in fact, be renewed to provide something new on current social questions. After all, we know religion best. That's our job. For example, when Archbishop Timothy Dolan in New York bleated and blogged against same-sex marriage recently, I was asked to say something about his natural law theology as a well-trained Catholic theologian. I dutifully studied his work and concluded that there was no reason to dignify his comments with theological arguments because there was no substantive theological foundation underlying his work. It was the endless repetition of long discredited notions based on prejudice. No need to pretend otherwise. I like to think I was useful, saving other people time and clarifying with a certain authority what was really operative in this case. You can read my piece that was on Religion Dispatches and judge for yourself. But I think that this is how we can be useful as activists. There weren't 10 people who could have done that. Sharing our knowledge and insights in the media is perhaps where we can have the most impact. Now, I heard your nervous laughter this afternoon when there was discussion of media training. But let me tell you from having made a lot of mistakes in the media, that media work is not as easy as it looks, but it's more important than we know. For example, and I'll tell this little story on myself. Years ago, I was working furiously against a deadline about 8 o'clock for some academic article. I have no idea what it was. When the producer of Nightline called. Remember Nightline, Ted Koppel? You have to be a little bit older to remember this, but the producer called about 8 o'clock. I was in the office typing away. and asked me to be on the show that evening. I think it was on abortion, and the show was on at 11:30. Would I please come down and be on the show? I was incensed. Who would call me at 8 o'clock? You booked me months in advance. Who are you kidding? I declined politely, saying that I had this chapter to finish, and maybe if I had had more notice, I could have fit it in. The producer was incredulous. She said, we call Alexander Haig at 11 o'clock, and he puts his coat on for 11:30, and the car picks him up, and down he comes, and he's on our show. I said something flippant about we'll call Al Haig and see what he has to say about abortion, and that was that. However, my friend Frances Kissling, the president of Catholics for Free Choice in those days, showed me the error of my ways. She's told the story so many times that the error of my ways have been pointed out so often, but she was right. She stressed that far more people would hear me on TV than would ever have read whatever academic article I was writing. What was I thinking of, she said. Producers call when they feel like it, up to minutes before or maybe minutes after a television show starts. If you want to get your message out, you hop in the car they send for you, you straighten your pearls, girls, and you go for it. Since then, I've done the Laird NewsHour, Ron Reagan's show, the BBC, among others. I get pressed into service when a pope dies or Rome says something particularly egregious about women, queers, or liberation theology. But it's a way to be useful. Graduate school did not prepare me to be in the media. Speaking in sound bites is antithetical to our training. That's why you were so nervous talking about this afternoon. I also think you have to have the right kind of media training. Hopping into the fray with a host who has no idea of the issues is not anything like defending a dissertation. Nothing about comps or orals prepares you for lights and cameras. But having scholarly having scholarly credentials and good ideas is a plus. The ability to think on your feet, a facility for pithy remarks, and a willingness to give it a whirl are all that is necessary to be useful. Radio is easier than TV. You can do it in your pajamas, and we all look better on the radio. Television is good if you have a lot of hair. I don't have a lot of hair, but you really need a lot of hair to do television. But whether TV, radio, or op-eds, the point is to put our considerable collective abilities to the service of our communities of accountability via the media. There is simply no comparison between how much impact one has on camera, on radio, or on the web. I once told the late Mary Daly that more people saw her on the Roseanne show than read her books. Now, having said that, media work is not for everyone. So if you're not inclined, you're not inclined. But for those who are inclined, I recommend a good, theologically focused media training program and a small ego, as it takes some doing to get it right. But it does take some doing, and you will get it right, and you can be very helpful. There are, of course, myriad ways to be useful, but they all require a certain letting go of expectations. For example, we as religious professionals don't always need to be in the foreground. We can work from behind the scenes. Nor do we always need to be in our professional roles. It may be as citizens, as neighbors, as voters that will make even more impact than as scholars. Useful activists come in many flavors. It's a matter of finding your niche and being willing to see activism as part of your portfolio. What blocks the flow, however? I want to look at what blocks the flow, and then I'll conclude with what I think helps to facilitate this, and then we can talk. What keeps us from being responsible academics and useful activists? Why are there relatively few of us who work in this combination? Let me venture 4 reasons. You can add more in our conversation, which I'm sure will be at least as rich as my remarks. First, I think there's an enormous fear that we will be seen as less than rigorous academics if we're too clear about our starting points. Myths of academic objectivity die hard. The threat that our work is influenced by our political and theopolitical commitments is still dangled over our heads as a negative. It is my view that everyone's work is influenced by his or her commitments. Some are simply more honest than others about this. Being honest about a commitment to overcome intersectionality and intersectionally unjust structures is a position I embrace without apology. In addition to this fear, in the second instance, there are real material constraints put on by academic institutions such that scholarly activism is often frowned upon. Many colleges, universities, and theological schools look askance at scholar activists, or what I prefer to think of us as scholar strategists. Not only does a good deal of what we do not count for tenure, it can actually count against one, especially in the informal arena where such decisions are often made. Being a scholar activist requires careful strategizing and prioritizing of time so as to comply with the rubrics of one's institution while at the same time using one's position as a springboard for activism. It can also mean choosing a so-called non-traditional job, meaning one outside of the academic mainstream. A third block is time and money taken as a unit. Done well, activism requires the same time commitment as teaching and scholarship, and vice versa. Unfortunately, activism is not remunerated as well, nor does it have the same weight or prestige in our field as teaching. This remains mysterious to me, since I think that those of us who work in the thick of social change are at least as valuable as those who teach, especially those who teach, for example, in small colleges and teach undergraduates. Wonderful work, but no reason to think that it's any more valuable than what we do as activists. I realize this is a hard sell to most graduate students in religion who see teaching and tenure as their goals. Well, here's another way to think. If one goes to grad school in chemistry, one becomes a chemist, not a professor of chemistry. If one goes to grad school in law, one becomes a lawyer, not a professor of law. So too in religion, if one goes to grad school in religion, one really becomes a professional in the field of religion, not necessarily a professor of religion. There are plenty of ways to be a theologian. For example, working as I do for a nonprofit, working in the publishing arena, working for a religious organization, moving into the public sector and government, among many other options. Frankly, the academic job market dictates this more expansive view if one doesn't want to embrace it oneself. Make your choice. A fourth barrier to religious studies is something I've alluded to earlier, and that is that religious studies is seen as an individual rather than a team sport. We're all schooled to take our own GREs, to take our own comps, to write our own dissertations, and to defend them very much on our own. What we are not taught is how to engage in collective, collaborative efforts, how to bring religion into sustained conversation with lawyers and educators and medical people, all of whom are part of the cultural mix that will make change. We have new skills to acquire beyond what the current curricula offer. And we have some skills and habits to unlearn from graduate school if we're going to be responsible academics and useful activists. For example, some writing deadlines are tomorrow, not a year from next Passover. This is how it works. When somebody calls you up and says, I need an article on XYZ, when would you like it? Tomorrow. Thank you, I'll be back. These are some of the barriers to responsible scholars being useful activists. What then are some of the ways we can facilitate this rich mix? I'll conclude with 4 next steps and look forward to your creative ideas in our discussion. The first is with whom we collaborate. If I'm right that religious studies is at best a team sport, then with whom we collaborate is crucial. Weeks of work like this are fertile ground for meeting the colleagues with whom you will work for decades to come. So look around for a minute, and you can see some of your future partners. Weren't they wonderful this afternoon, our 3 colleagues from last summer? What an example. And believe me, they will be at it for years to come, and they will make change. They're working at the intersection of anti-racism to overcome sexism and colonialism. By they, I mean you in this room, and to give expression to queer experience. These are your colleagues. These are your collaborators. How fortunate. When I was a graduate student, there was a program called Seminary Quarter at Grailville in Loveland, Ohio, for women in theological studies. We spent 6 weeks, not a week, so think about this, 6 weeks together on that lovely women's farm called Grailville. much like you are doing. We actually got academic credit for it. We too came from all over the country. To this day, some of my closest colleagues are from the summers at Grailville, Marie Fortune at Faith Trust Institute, Jeanette Stokes, Center for Women in Ministry in the South, Lois Martha Powell of the United Church of Christ Justice and Witness Ministries. We were all together in Loveland. Picture it, girls, Loveland. It was a great summer. I actually went back. I said I failed the first year. I went back the second year to be on the summer team and take advantage. Our faculty only came in on the weekends. People like Nell Morton and Rosemary Ruther and Ann Bennett, some of the great pioneers in the field. But that's what happened, and now, 40 years later, here we are still working together. And from a number of people who went to those programs, we started groups like Faith Trust and Water and Women's Theological Center in Boston, the Center for Women in Ministry in the South. So really entrepreneurial work came out of that, which I hope will happen here. That leads me to the second thing that I think can facilitate that, and it is imagination. Imaginative approaches are required if we're to maximize the potential of responsible academics being useful activists. The frank fact is that we do not have too many colleagues who do it well yet. This is in part a failure to imagine how one can, for example, teach in a research university and still find time to be an active board member of a queer nonprofit, or how one can work on queer theopolitical issues and also teach the occasional course. Online teaching, conference call board meetings, webinars, and other tech-enhanced efforts make the sky the limit. We need to imagine and create new configurations of our work according to emerging needs. This leads to my third, I would say, imperative of what we need to do, and that is to create new organizations that will house our efforts and employ our colleagues. I have long said that we need the equivalent of water for queer studies, a center unfettered by the demands of any university or theological school, unfettered by the demands of any religious group, a place where queer scholars and scholars of queers can study, strategize, and get the personal support that we need to do our work. Maybe several of you in this room will decide to create it. Let me know how I can help. And fourth, I think we also need to redefine the parameters of our work so that responsible scholars who are useful activists are really one and the same. This will take some doing, as many of the gatekeepers of academia continue their vigilance against engaged scholarship. It will also take some doing to persuade some activist groups that they would do well to consult with religious professionals, just as they use pollsters and focus groups to develop their strategies. So it will take some time to bring about this new identity for us, but making that happen is part of the work. The work ahead, in many ways, is more challenging than the work we have done thus far. Understanding and gaining rights for trans people, making religious sense and public space for intersex people, teasing out the feminist dimensions of being queer, making anti-racism a hallmark of our movements, developing post-colonial queer insights, and so many more challenges ahead of us will make our early accomplishments now look easy. There's plenty of pioneering work left to do. Thank you for your part in this exciting field. Let the responsible academics who are useful activists take the lead and go for it. Thank you so much. Thank you. I was asked to talk for a half an hour, so we'd really have some good time for discussion. I recommend that we do it this way, that we take literally 2 minutes, and I'll watch my clock. We take 2 minutes to talk with each other so that everybody gets a chance to lay out an initial sense or question to somebody else, just so you get your own thinking going, and then we'll open it up for discussion, okay? So I'll sit with Sharon Groves, and you find somebody else, and we'll talk, and I'll watch for 2 minutes. Thank you so much.
Oh, that was fun. That was really good. So I'm really interested in there's a lot of things I'm interested in. The question of how they just get it going, like start the nonprofit. And like the last piece that you said about imagination really struck home for me, because I feel like that we are in a moment where we're very imaginative about the problems, and we're not so imaginative about the solution, that we've kind of gotten stuck in this sort of slump around that it's like institutions with power are the only ones that can handle things. So whether it's a Democratic Party, whether it's HRC, whether, it's like you have to go there. I don't see a strong imagination right now around solution. It's like it feels very focused on problems.
I also think people are very paralyzed in terms of thinking about creating anything new.
Yeah.
That it's almost impossible to get people to imagine themselves doing something that nobody's done before.
Yeah.
That's what's really, that's what we need.
Yeah.
Is work that nobody's, creating something that nobody's done but created before.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why water is so exciting, because it's still creating something that nobody's created before.
Exactly.
And it works. I mean, as long as we can fundraise for it, it works.
Yeah.
And we need that in queer studies, I think. A place
Absolutely.
with materials, with computers, with people. And we have 3 interns coming in the fall, and they're going to be doing the same stuff that people did in the summer. They're getting publications ready. And
are they thinking about like how they can start their own?
I hope so.
Thing?
I hope so.
I mean, Robin and Nikki and Sarah are thinking that way.
I know.
Exactly.
I'm gonna duck out because I have a really early flight.
Oh, okay.
What time's your flight?
It's at 6:30.
Oh dear.
But I got up at 3:45 today. So.
All right. It was lovely to see you. Yeah, take care.
You're replying at our panel.
I am.
AR,
I'll see you there. Yeah.
And thank you for this. It's like such a great refresher of last. Yes, accountable communities.
Yes.
Love that.
Yes.
And Sharon, we don't get to talk enough.
I know it.
But
we were just talking about you. It's funny. It came up right at the right time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I hope the week goes well, and it's like so fun to in your camp this time just to pop in.
Great.
I'm glad you came, and and you guys did a great job.
I'm confused. I know you're a graduate student at Drew, but you're also listed as ILF.
Yeah.
Did you do your MDiv at ILF, and then okay?
I did. I was able to take your class, but my friend Ann Dunlap. You remember her?
What's her name?
Ann Dunlap.
Uh huh.
My friends were in class.
Yeah, it was a couple summers ago.
Yeah, I was there during that time.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, and then I worked at ILF for a minute too.
Okay. What happened to Stephanie, who worked there? She was in the doctoral program, I think.
Yeah, I think she sort of left to work on her a little bit more intensely, and she was doing some work for Naropa for a while. She was up in Boulder.
That's the last I heard of her.
So I haven't been in touch with her though. I should look her up. Yeah.
Great.
Organize all their summer.
Sheila Devaney, who's at Ford, was at ILF.
Oh, okay.
So she was there for. In fact, her husband is Larry Graham's still there, isn't he?
Yeah. She retired because they took her on full time now at Ford.
Did she finally retire
She
from?
retired, yeah.
Oh, did she? I'll be darned. Okay.
She was on leave. And
Yeah, right. And
doing RD and stuff. And then,
yeah, she was the person who started RD.
Yeah.
Wow. No kidding.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Now, RD's an imaginative. That's
an imaginative. Yeah, exactly. It's a good example.
Places.
I love that.
Yeah.
Great.
Like, yeah. And you guys are doing it too. You're figuring it out.
Are you ready to talk together, or do you want to talk a little more by yourselves? A little bit more? Okay.
There's like a lot of creativity around the problem, and there's a sort of dearth of creativity in some ways around solutions.
I totally agree. Yeah.
And it's about like being able to see your own agency, and it's about being able to have joy.
I'm really interested
Sometimes
in being
it's
in on
necessity, though.
conversations about
I think that it doesn't work on ideology. I think it works on necessity. I think sometimes you have to be backed up against a corner to get creative.
Yeah.
I think people who are fat and sassy don't do much.
Yeah.
People who can't do any. That's like when I was talking about starting water.
Yeah.
We didn't have a choice. I mean, out lesbian, pro-choice. Where are you going to go?
Yeah.
In 1982,
Right.
where are you going to go?
Right.
Who's going to hire me?
Right. Right.
So I mean, sometimes I think it's necessity rather than ideology that really makes you do it. I don't know, but I mean, and sustains it.
That's right. Yeah.
All right, let's see how they.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk? I mean, you don't need to bring it up tonight,
You can bring it if you want.
but I'm curious about sort of your writing discipline. I'm just curious. Like, do you have a set ritual? Do you just, I mean,
Depends,
where are your hang-ups? Do you have procrastinations, or are you pretty rigorous about it? Are you a fast writer? Are you do you set?
If I get up in the morning at 6 o'clock, I can be done by 7.
Yeah.
Almost anything. Between 6 and 7, I can do 5:30 and 7:30. Well, I have a child, and when she gets up, You know.
I have one too. That's important.
That takes the breath. But I'd be happy to talk about that. But I also want to talk about the kind of media training. I think you blew it with the media. I think you didn't have the right media training because you know what you have to do with these people. You have to teach them that they have to. If no matter what somebody says, they have their message going in.
So
This
here's
is
what
what-
I think
happened.
our media training was actually
We had a really good media trainer. We had Mackie Alston, who's good, right? What we did was we scheduled it for a Thursday. They were all tired. We have people, and there was all this energy
not
around. There's all this energy
It's
around.
ego.
Who am I?
No, it's ego. It's
You said
ego.
the ego thing.
Yeah, it's
I was
ego.
like,
You have to
oh,
let your ego go. And if you're in a place like this where you want to perform,
Yeah.
it's much harder. But if you teach people, make it a game, and play it, it can be fun. Just to
Yeah.
play at it, and then they learn some of the skills. Because what
Yeah.
you want to do is, like if I say to you, okay, here's the deal. Same-sex marriage is healthy and good. Okay? That's your message, Sharon. Same-sex marriage is healthy and holy. We'll do it healthy and holy. Okay, so I'm the interviewer. I say, what color is the moon? And you say, same-sex marriage is healthy.
Holy. Yeah.
How old is the
think
Pope?
I
Same-sex
think
marriage.
That's what. And what it had was there was so much fear that it
Yeah.
was impossible for.
No, you have to have fun. It has to be a joke. It has to be a laugh. Yeah. Are we ready?
That's right.
The floor is open for questions and comments and tomatoes and other things that might be. Thank you for being here. I know it's the end of a long, long day. How are you? Some of you are still ambulatory, and plus a time change and all kinds of things. But I'm glad you're here. We won't go late. What's our schedule tonight? We have to. We'll finish before then. Yeah. And maybe a glass of wine, put you right to sleep. Comments or questions, reactions, and say your name so that I get them again, and other people do too. So you reinforce those. Jared? Yeah.
I want to just express gratitude for what you're doing, and particularly where you talk about when our work, that kind of the disrespect it kind of gains, or like it's not seen as serious because it's like activism and scholarship is kind of like you didn't put that much work. Because for some of us, we have that because we're activists, and then we have that because we're queer activists, and then we have that because we're queer activists of color. And so it's like at every intersection, we have to work harder to be taken seriously. And the moment we start to speak from our context, like there's this idea that, somehow you can't be objective and you're just being subjective and silly. And so I think that it's important that we get voices of power, of tenure, you have set yourself up as like, I've got the goods. And I think people know that when they hear you. And so because of the work you're doing, it makes it easier for us to come behind you and do the same work, because we're not treading the same ground all over again of saying, no, really, I'm a serious scholar also.
Yeah.
And so I thank you for that. But I also, my question is, for example, I was fortunate enough by dumb luck, I think, to get a paper accepted to AAR this fall. And one of my struggles as I write is how to present myself. I'm a young scholar, it's my first time. And I know that no matter what I do, some scholar's gonna, be like, whatever, this young guy doesn't know what he's talking about. What are some things that we can do strategies in our writing, specific things that we can maybe employ to say, wait a minute, this is serious.
Jared, thanks. I appreciate it, and I think you're. I wish I thought you were right about how it will get easier, and I hope it does. But I also think that we're also complexifying the analysis and adding many more voices, and that there's both a backlash against that, and which all of us, but which you and others like you will in some ways experience. That's one of my great frustrations of this work, is that having done it for a long time, and then I hear somebody's story about being, wanting to commit suicide or having a hard time, and I just think, God, have we made no progress at all? That's sometimes in my weaker moments I think about those things. But I agree with you that there's there's a lot that you can bring to the discourse, and I think if you can know yourself that you bring the same academic rigor to the work, but you bring the honesty of your perspective, because everybody has a perspective. And the unnamed, what Carol Adams calls the absent referent, the unnamed dimension is what we're up against all the time. That's what Robin and Nikki and were talking about earlier this afternoon. And I think that's what one has to be very clear about, that in fact there's a very, the unnamed pieces around, especially race and class, make this very difficult. And I think that in our writing, that those questions have to be out there without apology, because that's where the authority comes from. It's not from the PhD. It comes from the authority of the voice. The credentials don't hurt, but it's the authenticity of the voice that gives you authority, not the credentials after your name. As far as the AAR, Rebecca was reminding me earlier today of a little piece that I wrote that's on the AAR website. It's called Be Brief, Be Witty, and Be Seated. And that's kind of good advice that has not been trumped yet in AAR lore about how to, have you read it? About how to write, give a paper. And I think there the issue is really that we want to hear you, not what you imagine somebody who might grade you or hire you or not hire you wants to hear. But we want to hear you, and that will come across. That will come across. I also think keep it simple. I think we all think we go to the AR and look at the backs of people's heads that, you know, the person in front of us is smarter than we are and they know all this and we don't, and we have. I think that's bogus, and I think you should go into it with that understanding that it just as if you were. My sister used to tell me, you know, when I was a graduate student, I was very convoluted and everything, and my sister would say, well, if you can't explain it to the woman next door, then you probably don't know what you're talking about. And my sister is a writer of children's books, and she's very smart, and she was right. If you can't explain it to the person next door, then you probably don't know what you're talking about. And one of the things that happens is that because we're trained in nuance and in complexity and problematizing and all the things that we do for a living, when it comes time to talking with the person next door and our house is on fire, you know, your house is on fire, you know, it's not like a complicated deal. And I think we have to get to that for safety, if you know what I mean. So that's just one approach. Yeah. Please. Yes. And
Natalie.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question about maybe your movement from, or your critique of academic work as individual
Mm-hmm.
and needing to be conscientious about who it is that you're going to collaborate with
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of stuff. And I find academic work to be very lonely. And though I'm finding and I found great conversation partners, some are in this room, and I hope you all will be my conversation partners going
Mm-hmm.
forward. But you know, conversation partners are one thing. Collaboration in actual production
Mm-hmm.
is different.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you could speak to that, if there are particular projects that you've worked on with other people, and if you like doing that, if that's something.
You want to speak to that?
Sure.
Rebecca Alpert and I collaborated on Good Sex. We won't say more than that, but the book is called Good Sex: Feminist Perspectives in the World's Religions. Rebecca, take it away.
I was actually talking about this at dinner, Mary. Reminiscing about one of the best experiences I ever had in my life, and it was thanks to Mary and two people that Mary was working with and some money that sort of appeared from the choir. But all right, we don't have to do that.
Ford Foundation money, Radhika Balakrishna, who's now at the Center for Women's Global Policy Studies at Rutgers, and Patricia Beatty-Jung, who's now at St. Paul's School of Theology in Kansas City.
They got together and they decided that anthologies were stupid because they didn't talk to one another. Essays didn't talk to one another, and so they created a collaborative project, and a wildly international collaborative project, and got us together at first to think about how we wanted to put these essays together that worked together, and then got us to actually write them, another miracle, and share them with each other, and then got us together again, I should say, in the Netherlands, because that just makes it feel
Amsterdam, where else would you study good sex?
we did the first one in Philadelphia, but all right. And we actually had conversation partners about the work that we were doing in these essays, and the essays really, I mean, that essay of mine was deeply informed by what other people were telling me about it and how I had to, you know, work with them, and I hope vice versa theirs. And then these three incredible women put them all together and made it feel like it was a collaborative project. And I do think I don't know if it's the best essay I've ever written. I think it's one of the best collections I've ever seen. Not that the essays are even, but because they were informed by each other. And that was a model that is really, it's a very important book. Rutgers published it with a really sexy cover. And actually, you know, my piece in it was reprinted recently. So, and it has, I mean, other people's pieces have had a lot of influence. It's had a life of its own. And it's that kind of opportunity that, you know, not everybody wants to, like, subject themselves to this kind of conversation and dialogue and criticism, but it felt collaborative and exciting and a way of just working together. So that in many ways, I feel like I didn't write that piece by myself.
Yeah, we had 12 scholars from 8 countries and 6 religious traditions. And we spent the first long weekend in Philadelphia trying to figure out the question was, what's good sex? And this was not a question that had been asked of women very often, really meaning it. And it certainly, we knew because we said we know what our various religious traditions think is good sex according to their lights, but nobody in those traditions has ever asked women what they think. So by the end of the weekend, we did not know what good was or what sex was. We had no idea. But we all went home and wrote our essays, and we sent them around to each other, got back the second time, talked about them, and then sent them again, and then finally put together the collection. And the idea was that we would talk, it wasn't, you know, it was a flip, it's a wonderfully provocative title, because the issue was really a play on words. What is good from a moral perspective and from a religious perspective, not you know, was it good for you or good for me? Although that, I think, is also a moral question. But I think that it really, as Rebecca said, it turned into a conversation that you can see throughout the book. And if you only read the introduction, it tells you about the process. And I think it really, in my view, it's the gold standard for how to do this kind of work. Judith Plaskow, for whom I have the deepest respect, said that in her academic career, it was probably the most exciting experience she'd ever had. And we had fun. We had a lot of fun doing it.
Picture on my refrigerator still of me and Judith and several others stoned out of our minds legally.
I had gone home with some of the other good women that evening. I was not at that place. It was shocking for some of us, but it went on. I think Judith's son had told you where to go or something. They were like the old brown cafes in Amsterdam. Other comments or questions, please go ahead, and then we'll come over here to you. Say your name again so we get it all. Marissa.
I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about how you constructed and continue to draw in your own community of accountability, and whether, particularly given what we talked about this afternoon as far as faith communities and standing inside faith communities ready for this work, whether that plays into that at all. And finally, sort of just how you balance your own kind of cutting edgeness with that community.
Yeah. Yeah, we had a conversation this afternoon when a bunch of us were talking informally about the biggest issue people had for me was, well, how do you still call yourself Catholic, you know, after all these years, and knowing that I'm an out lesbian who's pro-choice. I mean, this is not what the Pope is wanting to hear. And the question came up really, I think, in terms of your dissertation vis-a-vis Orthodox Jews and some of the same issues that come up in other religious traditions. And I talked at some length, which I won't repeat, but simply to say that I think the community of accountability question is central to each of us, and that I really misspoke. It's communities of accountability. It's really, in some ways, intersecting communities. So one explicit community of accountability for me is the movement of Catholic feminists, what I described as the Women Church movement, the Women Church convergence, what we call the best and the brightest of the bad girls. You know, that's sort of one group. Another group is certainly feminist theologians. We at Water have developed something called the Feminist Liberation Theologians Network, which meets at the AAR on Friday afternoon from 4 to 6. And we've had some of the most marvelous conversations in that group of people, which tends to be somewhere between 40 and 70 people. This year, one year we looked at, we deconstructed feminist, another year we deconstructed liberation, a third year we deconstructed theology. Elisabeth Schuster-Fiorenza and I run it together, and this year we're looking at some of the success stories. So we're having Shannon Clarkson, who ran the DMIN program for San Francisco Theological Seminary, Margaret Miles, who was at Harvard and GTU, Hyro Park, who works with the Methodists, a number of people who will tell very quick success stories of how they have developed feminist programs within institutions and sustain them. So that's another community of accountability. Certainly, the wider progressive Catholic community, not Women's Church, but the wider progressive Catholic community is a place where I also feel pushed and pulled, the kind of call to action people. And then groups like the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice or Catholics for Choice, groups that are working on issues of anti-racism, my work in Latin America. I mean, I feel very accountable to women in Brazil and Argentina with whom I work. So there's sort of, for me, there's like no lack of accountability. It's a question of keeping all those conversations going in a way so as to be informed. And also mostly listening to what people are saying, because I think that our tendency in our field is to put out our views, whereas I think if we probably listened more, we'd get there. I'm not sure what you mean by the balance question in terms of.
Well, I guess I'm just wondering how you reconcile it when those communities are asking you to back off or do something different, or I know for me,
Yeah.
I'm asking. I guess.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
To struggle sometimes. Part of one of my communities is the Episcopal Church, and I'm not ready for that work. In some ways, some of us are, some of us aren't.
Yeah.
And so that balance between, how much can I do right now? How much can I do here? And how much is a timing question about?
Yeah, it's interesting. I just spent 4 days with people from the Arcus Foundation. The Arcus has been funding a Catholic think tank to strategize about how to change the Catholic Church on queer issues. This is an enormously challenging topic, but we're getting there. Look what happened to Dolan in New York. Flat on his face, with many to fall behind him. But it's serious. We spent 2.5 years, about 20 of us, in 5 meetings trying to figure out a strategy and whom they should fund and how to fund and so forth. And one of the things that I heard over and over from people as the excuse is it's not time yet. People aren't ready. It's not the moment. We have to wait. And not expecting to live forever, that has never been a particularly persuasive argument to me. I think it often says more about the person who makes the argument than about the people that they're allegedly referring to. I think it's very patronizing as well. And I don't mean to suggest that you're that way at all, but I'm just, as I hear it in other contexts, I think that it's a very patronizing kind of thing, because it really says, there are strategic questions to be asked, and timing is all. But I think that for the most part, we are far too timid and far too protective of those who don't need our protection or shouldn't have our protection when we're really protecting ourselves. It's not time yet, i.e., I don't have tenure yet, or it's not time yet, I haven't finished my comps, or it's not time yet. I think those, I would exegete that particular phrase very carefully. And so many people said it at this meeting as the answer they were getting. I'm talking now particularly about how Catholic priests and Catholic nuns, especially, or Catholic theologians, handle these things when it's not time yet. And we're developing a think tank of those theologians to make it time. But we have to create at the same moment the institutions that allow them, when they get fired from their jobs, to have a place to go. This is what I mean by the creation of new institutions. Because I know full well that when some of my colleagues who teach at Our Lady of the Snowdrop, when they go into that freshman, which was my alternative to creating water, was Our Lady of the Snowdrop. But when I do my work and I say, look, this is a Catholic lesbian feminist position on XYZ, and I want somebody to take that into the mainstream of Our Lady of the Snowdrop, I have to make sure that somehow the person who does that is also going to be protected from not losing his or her. I can't guarantee that, but I have to at least factor into my analysis and to my work the creation of the spaces where people can do that. And that's where I think groups like this and your larger Carpenter project and so forth are so critical. And that's where the imaginative piece comes in too, because we have to imagine the solutions that will allow people to live well doing this. This is, in my experience, it is not a get-rich-quick scheme. Working for a nonprofit and doing this work. This is not a fast road to the big bucks. We have to fund, if you think when you get a tenured job, what you have to do is teach, grade papers, write a little bit, and go home. I have to do all that, plus I have to raise the money to pay the rent, to pay the salaries, to pay, so it's quite a difficult task. But if we don't attend to that and create those spaces, it's not going to happen. We've had 43 interns at Water, which means 43 women and men have come through our organization and are now out there doing, some of whom you know. And it's just great to know that they're out doing some work. That takes a lot to create the space to make that happen. So, yeah. Please. And your name is?
Bryant from Lancaster Seminary.
Bryant from Lancaster Seminary. Great.
I missed you last summer. Along the lines of advocacy, you mentioned the need of developing professional relationships sort of outside of the academy.
Mm-hmm. And outside of religion, too.
Yeah, so I actually just want to know if you could provide insight on sort of some of the strategic ways you do that, or have done that.
Yeah, that's so challenging because I'm thinking, for example, of a panel that I was on in New York where we were working on end-of-life issues, realizing that the religious right, and especially the Catholic religious right, is going to do to end-of-life issues what they've done to abortion. That's their new target. So there I was working with, doctors and lawyers to try to help them understand that there are other Catholic positions, what they need to do, what it means to be in Catholic hospitals. That's one example. And it's complicated work. There's also something called, the woman's name is Lois Utley. It's called Hospital Merger Watch, I think. It's on the merger of Catholic hospitals with so-called secular or other religious hospitals. And what happens, of course, is every time they merge, the Catholic hospitals trump in terms of their directives. So, woe be to somebody who goes into an emergency room in a Catholic hospital, even with a do not resuscitate order in triplicate, they're going to have a hard time. And so, working in conjunction with her group, those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking of there. Brian, did you have something else in mind or something up in?
No, I didn't know if you had some sort of strategic plan that you kind of think about when you want to sort of build network outside of the community.
Well, at the moment, I'm very interested in Sharon and I were talking about this in the congressional world. I mean, I think a friend of mine's in Congress, and he apparently talked to Nancy Pelosi about my work and said, there are Catholics who think otherwise. I mean, I was like, hello. And so I'm very interested in maybe doing some stuff with congressional staffs to talk about the reality of Catholicism on the ground versus what the bishops would say. So if Pelosi, this isn't the moment to do it, given. Although the vote apparently was, they passed it tonight, and so we'll wait for the Senate tomorrow. And that was, yeah, I know, it's a mess. But so it's not the moment to do that. But there will be a time when things settle down a little bit when I think we can do some more educational work with congressional staffs, because part of it is people don't know. And they really do think that the bishops represent more than themselves, and each one has one vote, as I tell them as often as I can. And, but their attempted influence is really brutal. Yeah. I saw another hand over here, I think. Is it? No? Please.
Yeah, Jake.
Yep.
I was really intrigued with, at the end, you mentioned the feminist dimensions of being queer, and as we're going throughout this week and trying to figure out our conceptual dimensions of queer for each of us, or how different they may be. And I was wondering if you could expand on that for us and what connections you see coming from feminism to queer theory.
Yeah, I'm working on a project actually that we got some funding from Arkell to work on, which is lesbian feminist Catholics. And it is my contention as I look, and I'm just looking at that one little sector and trying to both network and organize in that sector. It's my view that LGBTIQ is a bit of a fiction. Bonnie Morris, who teaches at Georgetown, has written a piece about the invisibility of the L word. And as she says, we might as well be lepers. That people say LG, I think this is also, by the way, true for BTIQ people, but BTI people, I should say. But I think that one of the things that's happened over the last at least decade is an almost complete erasure of lesbian experience, especially lesbian feminist experience, from most of what's meant to be queer. I think that it has, the erasure has been with a homogenization of queer as normatively white male, And I think that's what the panelists were saying this afternoon, that was a lot of their experience. I think that's absolutely true. And I've been working on this among Catholic lesbian women, especially in the context of Dignity, which is the Catholic group, which has always been overwhelmingly white male, but has made real strides. And yet, lesbian women, and now younger women who don't want to use the word lesbian, who don't want to use the word feminist, who want to use the word queer, and then we get into the questions of what's the difference between description and label and so forth. This is all conversation that I think we need to have. And I think we need to have it again in ways that we have not had it in a generation or more in our movements, so that people stop saying LGBTIQ so easily when what they mean is either queer or normatively still white, male, gay. And so I'm very interested in this, and I'm just at the beginning of my work on it. But I think that it will not so much produce something new in terms of lesbian feminist Catholics as it will do what it did recently at a meeting of Dignity. We had 36 people in the room, including trans women and gay men, and we used it as an opportunity to talk about how we talk about ourselves. And most people in the room hadn't done that in a very long time. And I think that alone is a reason to do it, because what you find is that you have everything from queer Catholic lady, which was one of the youngest women, to not feminist but queer, to lesbian feminist. You know, you have the whole spectrum, but the important thing is not what you get, it's that people talk. It's the agency of being able to say, this is who I see myself to be at this point, and this is how we're going to interface being that. But I think we have done ourselves an enormous disservice to use the LGBTIQ with such facility that we have erased not only questions of specificity vis-a-vis race and ethnicity, but we've also erased any specificity with regard to bi, trans, intersex, Hamas. We don't even talk about that. And I think that's the danger of queer labeling. That it's the same thing. The analogy to me is in the ecological movement, where ecofeminism has come along, and you have a lot of feminists doing ecological work. But I can't find an ecologist who's feminist. I think about Bill McKibben, for example, is a great name in ecology. Hasn't even thought about it. And much less, and when I say feminist, I don't mean gender. I mean the intersectionality of forms of oppression and possible liberation. And therefore you have ecofeminists talking about what is their work, but you don't have any ecologists talking about being feminist. And I think that it's something that we have ignored in the name of inclusion, which has led to false consciousness. So that's where I am on it. Does that help you, Jake? Yeah. Thanks. Sharon Groves.
Yeah, I wonder if you could speak to the creation of water, how that happened, just tell the story, and
you mean like the creation story of?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's right. And because I'm very intrigued by something that you said as we were talking here about the imagination and sort of, like I'm not seeing right now, and maybe it's just my purview, but I'm not seeing a lot of things like water being created. Yeah. So I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think this is one of those examples, and you are central to it, so you know what it is to create something that needs to happen. So I just want to start by thanking you for that, because I think you really you at HRC and Carpenter people have really put something together here. That's one of the few examples of something new in religious activism that's really exciting. The creation of water, well, there are always creation myths, but we recently, I told this afternoon, we came upon the 3 founding papers of water, and I mean, they looked, one would look like this, and the other one looked like this, and the third, 3 pieces of paper on which I had typed. This was before your time, many of you, but we had typewriters in those days, and I typed the Women's Alliance for Theology, and I had come back from working in in Argentina for a couple years, and Diane New, my partner, and I were what we called out lesbian pro-choice Catholics, all dressed up with no place to go. And we were very well educated, very well trained. She had a couple of master's degrees and eventually a MSW and a DMin and so forth, but we were out lesbians who were Catholic and pro-choice. And in the early 80s, there was no market for us. So friends of ours who ran Network, which is a Catholic social justice lobby in Washington that was started by 46 nuns from 25 communities or something, said, why don't you form something like Network for feminists in religion? And so we got a little team together, about a dozen women, and this is the founding myth. You know, you have always a founding myth. So I had written these 3 little pieces of paper and started to peddle them to the Methodist building downtown in Washington, where the churches have their headquarters for lobbying and so forth. And some of the very wise women who were part of the church bureaucracies kind of understood in ways that I didn't what a women's alliance for theology would look like. And this little group of about a dozen women, including Elisabeth, Shue, Sofia, Renzo, and Madonna Kolbenschlag, and some other really wonderful women got together, and they said, well, why don't you just do it? You know, why don't you just make this happen? And maybe Diane could do it, and you could do it together. I don't know how they thought we were going to eat. You know, this was like not on their screen. So the next day after this meeting, yeah, it really is. It just started. You know, just started. And literally, I mean, Diane was leaving her religious community, so she didn't have any money. I was coming back from mission. I didn't have any money. So, you know, we were like, okay, great, we'll just do it. So the next morning I woke up and I said to Diane, you know, this Women's Alliance for Theology is kind of flat, but, you know, I said, if we added ethics, which I like to do, and, you know, you like to do ritual, we could make it water, ha, ha, ha. And of course, as I always say, it's been ha, ha, ha ever since. And it was just a very serendipitous kind of notion, and it caught fire. I mean, water caught fire. It was really, and it really did. People liked it. We started having brown bag lunches down at the Methodist building with people. We started to have programs. The Sisters of Loretto gave us our first $1,000 or whatever it was because one of their sisters needed an office. And so we started with typewriters and eventually got a computer, and, you know, the rest is on we go. We never expected, I mean, we didn't have a 5-year plan, we have a 10-year plan. We didn't, you know, we just started something. And it's been very interesting as a very, it's entrepreneurial, but it's also, and I think this is what you were attracted to, that I said that it was not ideology but necessity that started it. I mean, we really didn't have anything else to do. And, you know, we could have started a restaurant, or, you know, I like to cook. I mean, but I think it was not, we were not in a situation where we could have, you know, the Our Lady of the Snowdrops of this world were not begging me to come and teach. And I taught 5 years adjunct at Georgetown in women's studies, and that was sort of ho-hum, but the theology department wouldn't have touched me with a 10-foot pole. They hired somebody ABD, I mean, rather than hire me. So, you know, you get the message after a while, it's not going to probably happen. And I also didn't want to be, after my frontier, after being in Latin America for 2 years and being part of a kind of larger ecumenical international community, frankly, it wasn't very exciting to me to go think about teaching undergraduate religion courses for, you know, until I got tenured and promoted and emerita and dead, you know, sort of. That was just not, you know, and so and the other thing is, which I think is I have to admit, is that being a white woman, being upper educated, being very experienced in the international world by that time, I had an enormous amount of privilege and symbolic capital to spend. And if I didn't do it, who was going to do it? If I couldn't make it work, who's going to make it work? And I think that requires a certain self-understanding. And Diane and I both came from families that, you know, they weren't going to let us starve. I mean, you know, we weren't relying on them, but that we weren't going to starve. I mean, and plus we had good health and nutrition and dental care and all those things that many people don't have, who don't have as much privilege as we had. And so if we couldn't do it and make it work, who's going to make it work? Who's going to build something new? But I do think it was that combination of necessity. We really didn't have a lot of other options. And the sense that this could really be a new place. My father always said, you know, buy property, they don't make any more of it. You know, that was sort of his businessman's attitude. And I think build something, because, you know, if you build it, it's like Mary Daly. You know, you create new space and you create new time. And I think we have to be imaginative about that. It is not easy. This is not for the faint of heart. But and also everybody doesn't need to do that. I mean, I think there are a lot of combinations of things that you can do, like this kind of project, or like what our 3 colleagues talked about earlier today. Imagine them in 10 years. You know, they have a couple books out. And how changed their lives are by working together. That's what so impressed me, how their lives are changed by being a team. And that's what I found at Water, too. It's always teams. It was a team that started it. It's a team that works there now. Interns come in. They become part, you know, Jake from Katie Zay. They become part of the team. There's not a lot of, you know, hierarchy in terms of who's what. mean, there's realism, but we really try to have an egalitarian kind of working model. So, is that? Yeah. But create. I mean, I really do think create's the name of the game. Yes?
I'm going to keep it short because I already have enough questions.
All afternoon? Yeah, no, I'm just easy.
Never ends. But we had a sort of beginning conversation where Jennifer was expressing sort of concern about media and speaking to the media and losing complexity in trying to speak in sound bites, and at the same time, maybe engaging an audience that wouldn't necessarily engage their encountering work at all. Sort of how to negotiate that and whether it can be kind of an indicator toward more complexity.
Yeah, it's awfully hard. I made a huge mistake out of the gate when in 1978 I was invited to speak at the Women's Ordination Conference. I was all of 27, and I knew everything. I was so smart. You can't believe how smart I was when I was so smart. And so I gave this lecture, 3,000 people, and I gave this lecture, and I had a standing ovation from 3,000 people. It was a very heady experience. And I was so smart. Did I mention that? I was so smart. So then they didn't tell me, but I had to go to a press conference after this lecture. So I went to and they didn't prepare me for this at all. And I was a graduate student in Berkeley. I had no idea. So I went into the press conference, and this guy, I'll never forget him, Roy Larson, who was the religion correspondent for the Chicago Trib or one of the Chicago papers. And so he asked me about something. I had talked about Eucharist. My lecture was called Roman Catholic Priesthood, Patriarchal Past, Feminist Future. And as part of the feminist future, I had talked about the fact that people celebrated Eucharist who were not priests, because there weren't women priests, but if women wanted to celebrate Eucharist, we would have a Eucharist without a priest, and it would be a Eucharist without a priest. It seemed pretty obvious to me. And so he asked me some question about the Eucharist, and I said, in all my 27-year-old brilliance, I said, well, I guess we have to start with Theology 101 in terms of describing what He was livid. He was livid that I would say such a thing to a learned religion writer like himself, Theology 101. I mean, I lost him. I lost him. Another person who was at the press conference wrote about me in an article, and she referred to me as more arrogant than Cardinal Kroll. Now, Cardinal Kroll of Philadelphia was apparently quite arrogant, but I had outdone Cardinal Kroll in this woman's. I think it was Margaret Steinfels actually wrote that, but somebody, one of these, or no, it wasn't. It wasn't Margaret Steinfels. It was someone else. But McCarthy, what was her name? McCarthy. It was the former wife of Eugene McCarthy. I can't remember her name, but anyway, I think she was the one. You know what I'm talking about? Mrs. McCarthy, the former Mrs. McCarthy. Anyway, so I mean, this was, believe me, I have made huge mistakes in this arena, but it takes doing. You have to, it takes, and you have to make mistakes to learn. I mean, I never said those things again. And I think it takes a lot of, not even training, but just somebody needs to help you. Nobody helped me. I'm not blaming anyone but myself, but nobody even told me there was going to be a press conference, much less help me to, as a 27-year-old graduate student, figure out how to handle the national and international press. This was a huge meeting. This was all over the world. My mother only wanted to know what I wore. She didn't really care what I said. She said, what did you wear? So it was just another thing. Appearance makes a big difference. I mean, you put on your pearls to do these things. One has to take this seriously, that most of what, people turn down the TV, turn off the sound, all they see is what you look like. And especially if you don't have a lot of hair. I've been up, do you know who Helen Alvarez is? Helen Alvarez, she was the Catholic spokesperson for the bishops against abortion. She's an attorney, and she has a lot of hair. And she looks great on, I look like a skin monkey next to her. We learn this. This is why I say we all look better on the radio. But these are things that you learn. And you also have to have a very small ego, because it's tough. It's very tough. And most people in the media do not know what you're talking about. They don't know one thing about background. All they want to know is yes or no, this or that. And so if you don't want to do that, don't do it. And I don't think we have to say that everybody has to do that. I think different people have different skills and different gifts, but that we should encourage those who do to learn how to do it and do it well. And also be prepared for the surprises. And then, you know what? It's over, you forget it, and you go home. It's, you can't take it like you're a media rock star or something. It's just... Did you have something else you wanted to say about that? Anybody in that conversation? Did I? Yeah. Go ahead.
Actually, I'm thinking
Something else?
Something else.
Okay, well, let's finish that. Does that get to what you all were? Oh. Yeah, go ahead. You want to do something else?
Yeah, I guess
We're also at 9 o'clock, and I don't want people to stay longer, so let's just maybe take this, and then we'll go and have wine and cheese, and we can chat. I want to respect the time here. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I guess I'm interested to know your sense of, what the academy normatively should look like, or might look like, because I've been very interested in your hesitations about women being ordained,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm wondering if there's a similar sort of structural analysis that you might apply to the academy, and or to become bishops, for instance, in the Catholic Church. This is not necessarily like what we're
A good thing, yeah.
That's not necessarily a good thing. Is there a way that kind of analysis also applies to the academy and what we ought to be seeking as academics? And I guess also, just to fill the picture out, in terms of our objectives in society as well, is there a correlation there, extra institutionally?
Yeah, this is, thank you. This is part of a conversation that we were having this afternoon on a number of issues, and one of the questions that we talked about was, I was talking about the question of ordination of Catholic women, and in my early work, I certainly was a proponent of that, and in more recent work, I have taken exception to it because I think that it fundamentally reinscribes and reinforces the hierarchical model of clericalism, hierarchy, and so forth that's fundamentally problematic in the Catholic structural setup. And so to add women to that, it seems to me, is to reinforce and reinscribe, because women look better in the dresses, and some of us are more skilled than some of our priests who aren't very skilled, so that we end up making it look good rather than laying out the problems of that structure. So if you can think of it this way, that as much as I favor obviously equal justice for women and men, or for queer people and straight people or whatever, I'm even more interested that the structures change, so that instead of putting women on the top of a hierarchy, that we develop the kind of interlocking forms of communities that really do have different things going on, but that somehow have a more egalitarian way of being. And so that's the analysis that I was using this afternoon with regard to the question of ordination. So it doesn't thrill me to see women ordained in the Catholic Church and becoming bishops and so forth. These are strategic differences. People would, and I always have to say, it's like same-sex marriage. I don't think same-sex marriage is the greatest thing either, because I don't think marriage is the greatest thing. And I think that what happens with marriage is that it privileges some people and disadvantages others, so that people who are lucky in love also are lucky under the law. And since if you're married, you're one person away from being single. So I'd rather think, even though I've been in a 32-year relationship, I'd rather think about the common good and how we socialize the resources that get us health care, not because we have a partner who has a job, but because we have bodies. And so this is another discussion, but it's along the same lines. And so, of course, at the same time I say those things, I also say, if anybody's going to get married, then everybody should be able to get married. If anybody's going to be priest, then everybody should be able, So the kind of gum-chewing justice, obvious justice component is I comply with. But when I envision what I think is really necessary, and when we have in the experience of Catholic priesthood, now we still can keep a wall, we can still keep a horizon because it isn't here yet. Once it's here, it's something else. But that's why I keep the horizon. I think the same thing in academia. I think that we've gotten stale. And I think one of the reasons why so much of it is boring is because it's become very predictable. And the economics, Sharon, one of the issues that you're raising about being creative is the economic situation of the current moment makes it very difficult for people to be imaginative because they can't think beyond paying their bills. And so to imagine creating a structure where they would risk to do that is another piece of it. And I think it goes to your question that to imagine a different kind of academia where what we would reward was the authenticity of voices, and what we would encourage is the kind of choral approach rather than the soprano. You know, it's like if a community wants to train one soprano to be a magnificent singer and send her to Juilliard, or do we want to create a community chorus? And I think academia can be more like that, where we create many more diverse ways of learning. Because one of the things that we have found out in the last 20 years in education is that people learn very differently. And so the cookie cutter approach to how those who do the teaching doesn't match up with the variety of ways in which people learn. And I think that's one of the great insights, and that has to do with cultural differences, it has to do with linguistic differences, it has to do with racial ethnic differences, gender, sexual identity. There's so many ways in which diversity among us can be utilized to think about new ways of teaching. And so I can understand why my colleague said she's bored when she looks at her writing, because what she's doing is what she learned in graduate school a long time ago. And she does it brilliantly, but she's bored. And I think a lot of people are bored. I think a lot of higher education is boring because people are still, and yet to imagine, if you're a graduate student, to imagine something else, right? Some of it's very boring. I mean, you have to be honest. Yes, it's very boring, right? So the question is, It is, it's terribly boring.
Well, it's also scary to imagine something else.
It is very scary to imagine.
After you're,
yeah, if you've invested. That's right, and that's what happens, and the more you're invested, that's why I said this afternoon too, someone said, at what point do you then venture out to do something